Okay, thanks for coming. Let's stand for the pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
President Daly?
Here.
Vice President Headland?
Here.
Trustee Clements?
Here.
Trustee McNall?
Here.
Trustee Parr?
Here. Thank you. Our next Board of Education meeting, it will be held on March 2nd, so back-to-back meetings next week at 7 p.m. right here in the auditorium. And I'd like to remind everybody that the Board of Education trustee packets are available. And Ms. Platt can chime in here if I'm missing anything, but to get a packet, you can either pick one up from the district office or email Ms. Platt directly at cplatt@haldaneschool.org. And the petition packet also is very clearly describes all of your responsibilities to turn that packet back in. And I will speak on behalf of my colleagues to say that if anybody is interested in running for school board and has any questions about our role and responsibilities and what it all means and all the fun that we have, we are very happy to share all of that. So please don't hesitate to reach out. It is time well spent. Okay, that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Benante for our COVID-19 update.
Yeah, thank you, Jen, and welcome back, everybody. I know it's been some time since we've had the opportunity to meet in person, so it's good to see you all, or most of you, I should say, in person. Sean, it's good to see you through Zoom. It's been a busy 2 weeks. I think back to early January and noting in a communication that I felt that we were coming upon the period of time where that was likely to be the most difficult in terms of COVID management, that being January and February. And I hope it wasn't a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I do feel that the last 2 months or the greater part of the last 2 months have been a bit more stressful than usual when you take into consideration the infection rates in the community being relatively high in January in comparison to other points. It's just a period where individuals tend to get sick anyway. And then you had on top of it all the weather of the last 2 weeks. It's been tough to keep kids in school consistently, but we were happy to have a full day of school today. And as we continue to manage this, a few updates for you. First, on the vaccination front, pleased to report that by the end of this week, approximately 70% of our teaching staff will be fully vaccinated. So that's just inclusive of teachers. We're still sorting through how many members of other departments, if you will, have their first and or second dose of the vaccine. But I think on one front, that's positive news. And we do think that the Putnam County Department of Health will open up another first dose vaccination pod this week, potentially, as some vaccinations that they had en route were delayed, but now are expected to come in today or tomorrow. So we're awaiting word for that. So that should help us help our staff who wants to become vaccinated an appointment, hopefully in the very near future. Last week, the CDC had released updated guidance for schools. You may have read about that in the newspaper. I would say, for brevity's sake, there was really no major impact on what we're currently doing in New York State based on that guidance. The guidance seemed to be largely consistent with what the New York State Department of Health had issued some time ago as far as the mitigation strategies and standards and recommendations that were made to schools. That being said, there are components of the CDC guidance, and I think what we can anticipate in the near future being sometime between now and the end of the year, that there may be some changes at the state level given the fact that teachers are now becoming vaccinated. We have a lot of data and a lot of information now to analyze regarding this potential for spread of COVID in schools, where we may see some changes to the guidance that's been provided by the Department of Health at a state level to potentially incorporate more students into a physical school setting. in the near future. So we'll await that. It's just a suspicion that I have. I'm speculating, but I do think that you can see the tea leaves, if you will, that we may be very well heading in that direction. And the good news is, as of right now, the infection rates in our community are much lower than they were just a month ago. And if that trend were to continue, and again, vaccinations were to ramp up, the potential exists to examine how we can incorporate more students to be physically present in our school, specifically at our high school. Obviously, at the K-8 setting, we were in pretty good shape from the beginning of the year, but that is something that I think may come up for us between now and the end of the year, and that'll be a problem we have to solve. We have to look into that and figure out how we would do that, obviously in a collaborative manner with our faculty and with our parents. But I think that's a good problem to have, considering that we're coming upon a year now that we've been in this type of environment, and I think we've all looked forward to the time when we could begin to get back or reestablish some sense of normalcy on our school campus. So with that, I'll just pause to see if there's any questions. I do have a few other updates, but they're non-COVID related.
Just a quick question on testing, either status or plans or those things.
Thank you, John, for reminding me. I actually left that out of my report. If not, by the latter part of this week, early next week, you will see, and we just got pushed back on our timeline a little bit with the weather the last few days. We are looking to establish an in-school testing structure. You're familiar that we did the all-remote day where we had families make appointments, and that was helpful. However, we see that there's some gaps in doing it that way, obviously, with families who potentially can't come onto campus on an all-remote day like that because of their work schedule or any other reason. So we want to make the testing available during the regular school day. And what we would need from our families is consent to do so. So the first step of this is a communication coming out from my office to indicate the process for consenting for your child to do so and for us to test your child. And that will be done through the Family ID process, which we use for athletics. And then once we have established a list, we'll begin the process of facilitating testing a cross-section of our students and our staff each day. The staff component of that is not as complicated as the student piece. And our initial goal was to begin to do so next week. However, with some delays or all remote days last week and a half day yesterday, we just haven't had the chance to put that communication together and get it out to families. So it's going to take a few days for families to register. And our hope would be that every family registers. We can't test any child whose family does not consent to do so. So we'll work with our PTA. I think I have a PTA meeting tomorrow night, so I'll be announcing it there as well, with the hopes that we'll continue to keep that in place over the next, I think we have enough tests for the next 2 months or so, and then we'll order more and see where we're at that time.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And there's no athletic report, so I'm assuming athletics is going as planned.
They are. Basketball right now for us has been going on. Our boys and our girls teams have been competing through this week, and a couple more games scheduled for this week. And so far, with no issue. In both, we decided to have the senior nights as early on in the season, just in case, because we really wanted to make sure that we had the space to recognize our senior student athletes on both the boys and girls teams. So the families of senior athletes, or 2 spectators for each senior student athlete, is allowed to come to those games as per section policy. And we were able to honor our male and female student athletes.
I just poked my head in down there because I was a little early,
Yeah.
and it was just the students, just the athletes and the coaches, but the music was on.
It's all going on.
Like a real game, and they had, the heads in the seats, so it was sad to see, but glad to see.
We're doing the best we can,
Yeah.
considering all the
Thank you.
restrictions. Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Romanino and really the coaching staff, Ms. Perrone, Mr. Virgidamo have been great in making sure that things run smoothly with respect to basketball.
Yeah, it very much looked like all the rules were being followed.
Just one transitional note. You may recall a story from last year where a former Haldane graduate, Miller Francis, who works down at New York Presbyterian, had put a request out for PPE. And if you remember, a year ago in the early days of the pandemic, there was a shortage of PPE in hospital settings. And we lent some goggles from our science department to Miller to bring to her unit. And Miller sent a nice thank you note to our, because obviously she's been very busy, but to our staff who were involved in facilitating that transaction, if you will. And I just wanted to mention that. I have a copy of the note here, which I'll forward on to the board through the Friday report so you can all see that. Just a few other updates. Last week, again, keeping the main thing, all Haldane faculty and staff had the opportunity to attend a professional learning overview on a curriculum design template, which incorporates the Haldane essentials: critical thinking, problem solving, communication, emotional intelligence, wellness, growth mindset into their planning. So this was a broad overview we provided for all staff as they continue. And we have a cross-section of our staff who are really working deeply with this, with Judy and with Angela Layler, who we're working with as a curriculum design fellow. And so we have about 15 staff members who are really immersed in this work, but we wanted to provide an overview for all faculty, and we did so last week. Judy and Marianne Silke were helpful in facilitating that process with our staff via a virtual environment, obviously, but important first steps that we're taking. So when our staff goes into a unit planning mindset, which happens periodically, they have a framework, the beginnings of a framework established for how they can bring a level of intention into thinking how we will elicit these skills in our students when they're teaching language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, and the like. So I was really appreciative to see that work going on last week. On another note, last night we received word from the U.S. Department of Education that there's going to be some level of state testing that is expected to continue through this spring. I was a bit disappointed in that. I understand the basis of the Department of Education's stance, which is this is a mechanism to assess how students have done or how they are doing, in particular through this really unique time. I would have liked to have seen some flexibility given to districts who may have internal processes, one of which Mrs. Sniffin's going to speak to tonight a little bit about how to account for how our students were doing through this, again, this very unique period. So it is what it is. We'll await further guidance from New York State on what this will specifically look like for our schools in New York and for Haldane, obviously, but we can anticipate now that there will be some level of state testing going on towards the latter part of this school year.
Dr. Benante, was that including, it was unclear to me when I was reading that, does that include the Regents exams?
Yeah, that is unclear right now when you read that. Okay. So I would expect that we'll get more from New York State Education Department on what that means for Regents exams, because it is unclear in the letter that the U.S. Department of Ed sent out last night. It's a year where there's been a lot of obstacles and a lot of hurdles, and I just can't help but to think that, and I'm an advocate long-term for the state testing program. I think it does serve a purpose. I don't think it needs to be done the way that it's been doing, not to that it's historically been done, but I'll get off that soapbox. I just think that unfortunately this year with everything going on, this is going to be another obstacle or another hurdle. And again, we have other mechanisms where I think we can account for and have accounted for how our students are doing or have done over this last year from an educational perspective to fill that gap. But we'll obviously meet our responsibilities there for school accountability purposes. I'm going to hold off, Jen, I just did want to thank Sean and Margaret on attending the Westchester Putnam School Board organized meetings with our with Assemblywoman Galliff and State Senator Serino. Those were good conversations. Obviously, we had our colleagues from other districts as well who participated in those. Perhaps we can talk a little bit more about those during the WIPSPA update. But just as another point of transition before Julia comes up, you may have received your issue of Hudson Valley Magazine. If you haven't, I'll make sure I buy 6 copies for all of you. This was the annual issue where Hudson Valley Magazine recognizes its top high schools in the area. And I'm certainly pleased and honored to see that Haldane High School was listed second in its list of top high schools in the Hudson Valley area, and there's a lot of high schools, there's a lot of school districts in the Hudson Valley. So to be featured so prominently in this list is something that we're all very proud of as a school community. Our high school specifically has been recognized in many ways over the years as a reward school or school of excellence at the state Department of Ed level, now through our local community as well. So congratulations to Julia, our high school staff, and really the high school is the culminating experience for all of our students. So it's really something that it's really a recognition of all of our staff who are working with our kids going up. But specifically, though, I wanted to make mention of that. With that, if I may, if we can transition to Julia's report.
In a minute we can. I
Sure,
just
no
also
problem.
wanted to make sure we recognize Mr. Paparo
Yes, I
and
have that
Ms.
here.
Kilpert,
Ms. Kilpert.
who were also recognized in the article
Yes.
for Teacher Appreciation
Teacher appreciations.
Awards.
Yes, thank you, Jen, for making note
and
of
just
that.
one more thing, we're not doing, sorry, Julia. We're not doing a budget report tonight,
We are not.
but did you have anything you wanted to share, or anything with the board or the public about how the budget development is continuing? Or just that it's continuing?
It's continuing. It's probably becoming one of the more complicated budget developments that I've had the experience to work with, having been a little more intimately involved in budget development for the last, 8-9 years now. Simply because we don't know this federal stimulus package and the lack of clarity around what the impact of those monies will be eventually as they make their way into New York State and then into our schools is tough because we don't. So if you consider that we have about 10% of our budget, which is not as significant as other districts, but it's a big chunk of our budget that is influenced by a state level funding. And having uncertainty around that and what it may mean is tough. So it takes us automatically off our schedule, but the hard deadline at the end isn't going to change. So we're still going to have a budget that we have to present to the community in May. We still have a budget that the board's going to have to adopt sometime in April. And we have now this window that's continuing to become more narrow in trying to determine what the impact may be to Haldane and how that may influence our planning for the upcoming school year. As you know, I don't like to be alarmist. I don't like to cause any undue or unnecessary stress or anxiety for our staff or for our school community when it comes to potential issues of funding gaps. But there's coming a point where we very well may just have to, put 2 scenarios or maybe even 3 scenarios out there, no different than Governor Cuomo has to some extent in how he's planning for the state budget and how we may have to plan for our school budget, depending on how that timeline narrows. I hope to have a better structure for presenting this for the board next week. Ann and I are working on this now because we want to digest it down and present it in an easy way our school board and our school community can understand, knowing that there's significant outstanding variables. I will say just one last piece, the tax cap component that Ann had mentioned, where our tax rate essentially is being set at CPI, is significant. Not being able this year to go up to, or having that figure set at 2%, instead it's 1.2% that's factored into our levy equation. That's a big deal for us. And part of our discussion with our legislators, Sean and Margaret will recall, was in your efforts now as you're working at the state level to establish that figure at 2% instead of 1.2% for us, roughly, is a big deal. It's tens of thousands of dollars, which for a district like ours, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars for bigger districts. But at scale, it's a significant amount of money, and we see a middle ground there that would still allow the state or Governor Cuomo to hold on to the 2% levy structure, but it's not providing us, I think, with the flexibility that we would like to have in what's already a difficult budget process. So you'll hear us speak a little bit more about that next week. But I know you've already heard that from Ann, so I wanted to mention it again.
Just on that, can you talk about your sense of timing to clarity, e.g., let's start with the first one, which is the 2%, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a hard stop on when the legislature or the state would make any changes?
They're required to adopt a budget now by law by, I want to say it's April 1st.
Yeah.
And typically the legislature has done that. There's been years where they haven't, but the legislature has tried to honor that.
Okay.
Mind you, the board adoption is shortly thereafter.
Right.
So, but we usually have an idea the weeks prior to that weeks loosely, how that's shaping up.
Yep.
So our legislators are good at giving us the aid run, and the draft aid runs at that point that have been updated with whatever they're resolving to at a state level at that point. So I would say today's the 23rd, so our hope would be that a month from now, we'll have clarity on the tax cap matter, because that would be included as part of that.
Yep.
I don't know on the stimulus end necessarily
right.
how that's going to trickle down and on what timeline. Obviously, it's unique.
Okay, all right, because that involves both the
It does.
federal government and then state ramifications.
The state has to then take it, the federal government will allocate a certain amount of funding for schools, for public schools. The state will then, whether it be through NYSED or in collaboration with the state education department, will have to determine now what formula they're going to utilize for determining how those monies go to schools. And, that's it's a little bit outside of my...
And John, I'll just share. So I was at the legislative panel with the New York State Senators, so Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Shelley Mayer, and they were not optimistic that the 2% emergency 1 year just put it up to 2%. I mean, they were really not optimistic that was going to happen in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that wouldn't be surprising.
So, although that would be really nice and might help us, and not just us, but all schools, climb out of a hole, it's not something we can necessarily bank on.
So Magic 8 Ball right now is that's not going to happen, and we may or may not have any transparency to trickle-down federal aid by the time we need to adopt a budget.
Correct.
Okay.
And, Ann will speak to
where we know.
Yeah, right, and how those funds are structured and how the state chooses to utilize them. Not only can set up an issue this year, but also down the road. So a lot to, there's going to be a lot to digest and to work through over the next 6 weeks, I would say, looking at the time between now and when the board adopts a budget to present to the community.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have space for extra meetings if we need it?
Always.
We'll make it.
There's always space if needed.
No, I appreciate the question, and the board's been good about in years past. I think we may have had to need an extra meeting or two, and this
here or there
this may be a year like that, depending on how much we're trying to make sense of and process in what time we will have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good news is I think the budget vote process is going to be a little more straightforward than last year. I don't think, and speaking with Catherine, I think we have a good plan in place for tallying votes and for facilitating the beginnings of a good plan in place for tallying votes and all of that. So where it all coalesces to, I think that process will be, we're prepared for, especially after last year.
So, just an expectation is a normal vote, normal date, in person.
As of right now,
Okay,
we're, yes,
Okay, great.
it's looking that way.
Okay, thank you. I think we might be ready to move on to Ms. Sniffin's report.
Long-awaited report.
Sorry.
So as Julia's coming up, I'll just set this up. I believe John and the board had a discussion earlier this school year about how we could examine the data that we do have available, whether it be through the NWEA or other school-based assessments, to determine what the impact was of on our students of the I won't say interruption, I use that term lightly, but to their schooling towards the end of last school year. So what I've asked Julia to do, and each principal will provide as a part of their report, is an overview of the process that they employed with their teacher leaders, department leaders, to examine that very question. So that's one part. There's a few other things that Julia is going to share in the high school detail report, but I don't want you to think we're not answering that question. I know some time has passed, but it seems best in terms of that discussion being centered between the board and our building principals. So that's one part of Julia's presentation this evening. And again, I'll stop there. Julia, thank you. I'll turn it over to you now.
Just before I start, thank you, Dr. Benante, for mentioning the #2 high school in the Hudson Valley. And also, credit not to me and just the teachers, but a credit to our families, our students, the board, the entire community, in supporting public education and what we do. So thank you, everybody, for that. As Dr. Benante mentioned today, this evening, hopefully I can get, there we go. This evening, we will definitely focus a little bit on testing and NWEA, but in addition to that, I think it's important to understand the current structure of the high school and really what it looks like day to day as we talk about COVID and how it's impacted our students. Going back to March, right, when it happened to now. So it's been basically a year that we've been faced with this. So we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at NWEA. And in addition, I think it's important to recognize, right, NWEA being one measure, we know we have multiple measures that we look at when we're evaluating how our students are doing. And it's important to recognize that even assessments in classes based on the model in which we're teaching have adjusted and changed over the course of the year. So we'll dive a little bit into that. And then the whole child. You hear me say this often, right? We have a job and a responsibility to academically challenge our students, meet them where they're at, and move them forward. But we also are part of helping them grow, helping them develop, and helping them figure out their passions, their love, even beyond just the classroom. So we'll talk a little bit about the whole child and what we're trying to do in that area, including social, emotional health and well-being. So, that said, to start the current learning model at the high school. When we started the year, we were looking at it like, okay, there's two things. There's the kids that are home, and there's the kids that are hybrid. And as this has evolved, we've recognized there's really 4 cohorts that are existing right now. There's the students A through L who come in for 2 days and then are home for 2 days in a hybrid model. There's the students that are M through Z who come in for 2 days and then are home for 2 days. There's our vulnerable population, our at-risk students that we have in every day. And then we have our all remote students. So there's really 4 groups that are going on at the same time that the teachers are working to navigate. And even there's 4 different attendance tracks every period to keep track of that. We are evaluating our cohorts every 5 weeks. I think you are familiar with that, deciding and determining where students are at, whether they're all remote or hybrid. And we have seen at the high school a different pattern than we see at the elementary and middle school. We started with just about all of our students in the building. A very low percentage of students were all remote. And as the winter has started and that contact tracing has happened and we've been calling to make calls for 10 days of quarantine, you see more and more students opting to stay home in an all remote environment. So that is a trend we are definitely seeing. We did see, I will just mention, this last 5 week, we did see a little bit more of an increase back in the hybrid model, which was a good sign for us. But right before the holiday break, we had a spike in all remote. This is what the schedule looks like. Elementary and middle school are podded, right, or they're cohorted. And they basically are together just about all day long. I know there's a little bit of an exception with the 8th grade. But in the high school, small high school, every student's schedule is unique. The amount of patterns that exist within our schedule, I couldn't imagine how many there are. So in order for students to take the courses they would want to take, podding them was not a viable option. So we then, as our group, looked at, okay, well, how do we then reduce exposure, one, to students, and two, to teachers and staff, to prevent, if we do need to contact trace, how large is this going to get? And what we opted to do is the schedule in front of you, where the students, we typically have a 9-period day, right? What we did was we split it in half. Everybody has lunch at the same time. Students would come in for day 1, let's say they're A through L. They're in for day 1, they have periods 1, 2, they have lunch, and then they have periods 6, 7. They come in again the next day, and they have periods 3, 4, they have lunch, and they have 8, 9. Then they're home for 2 days with that same pattern, and the other group is in. So people were saying, like, why didn't you just do Monday, Tuesday? We really were looking to get our students in the building at the high school as much as possible, but keeping within a rotation that seemed to make sense. So that, for clarifying purposes, just so you can understand, that's where we were at. I think one of the things we're hearing back from families at the beginning, it was confusing for the students and keeping track of it. And what I'm hearing from families now is a level of independence. And the students feel more of like this I don't want to say college, but it's an hour, the periods are an hour and 20 minutes long. It's a very different structure than what they're used to in terms of classroom and learning. So a couple things on the model to just point out. Again, always, COVID, non-COVID, we're focusing on the individual learner, their academic performance, their social, and their emotional well-being and where they're at. The cohorts are following the same thing. Every classroom, the cameras are on, every period, all period. So the student is streaming right into the classroom. The hour and 20-minute periods are allowing for deeper learning experiences, focusing on critical thinking, the communication, and the problem solving, keeping the main thing. You'll see in the classes, mini lessons, you'll see whole class. We stuck with Zoom right at the beginning. If you remember, there was a lot of question about Zoom, but the ability to make breakout rooms in Zoom and have teachers going in and out of breakout rooms as students are navigating content has been critical for our high school staff and students. So those breakout rooms are great. And then coming back together at the end of class, the students that are in the classroom with the students that are virtual to share out. We still have our 10th period extra help for students that they can take advantage of. We did start back up Heart. It's a little harder to get our attendance at Heart in the virtual setting. I think they're somewhat done with their screens by the end of the day, so we're looking at that. We're back to the standard numeric grading system. We were using ABCD when we closed last spring. And attendance has gotten a lot better. At the beginning of the year, I think the students were adjusting to logging on at home by themselves, typically, right, developmentally. Mom is not standing right next to the 17-year-old, get on. But we've seen a nice improvement in attendance virtually, and we're happy for that. So transitioning from the structure, we'll talk a little bit about assessments and where we're seeing our students academically. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to look at NWEA, but we're also going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the classrooms to help us navigate our students and their success. So K-12, we use NWEA. A component of NWEA is what's called MAPS testing, which is a measure of academic progress. And when you are giving MAPS assessment, you are then setting yourself up to look at the achievement of students, so how they're actually doing academically, how they're growing and making growth over time. You're able to look at the individual student to determine maybe what are some needs and what are some resources down to the standard level that they may need supports in. You're also able to set goals for students to say, all right, here's where you're at. We'd like you to make some progress by the end of the year here, and communicate that with students in terms of goal setting. And then in addition, looking at achievement patterns throughout your grade level, or whether it's a department that you want to look at achievement data, it will provide that for you as well. So again, that's K-12. There are 3 primary reports at the high school that we looked at the beginning of the year. Now, mind you, again, we have 4 different cohorts, so administering an assessment like this and a valid, structure, same, you're here, you're home. There is definitely some variation this year to be considered when you're really analyzing it. And it goes back to making sure you look at those multiple measures, not just one. So back to what I was saying, the 3 reports that we look at. The first report that you see here is called the Student Profile Report on the left. And that just shows you one student, where they are in terms of growth for the time measure that you're looking at, and where they are in terms of achievement. This is often a report we share with parents. This is a report that teachers would bring to a CST meeting if we were talking about how a child is doing. The chart on the right is looking at a whole class. So you're a math teacher and you want to look at everybody that's sitting in front of you. You would pull up this chart. And in the green, it's showing you students that are high achieving, above the norm, above, where students are nationally or where students are just within our own building we can look at. So they're achieving high and they're growing, right? Now, when students are achieving high, typically your growth rate is smaller because you're almost at the ceiling. So you're not going to grow as much. When you're in first grade and you're learning how to read, you're going to grow a lot because there's a lot of reading to learn to do. And this measure, and Dr. Benante was talking about this at the beginning, the state assessments are a paper and pencil and it's stagnant. It's going to tell you, are you above grade level, below grade level? That's there's some data that comes out of it. I'm simplifying it. But these assessments, what happens is a student will take a question and answer a question. If they get it right, they get a harder question. If they get it wrong, they get an easier question. And it fluctuates to give you pinpoint information in terms of where the learner is and what are the things that maybe you should focus on as teachers. So we talk about valid measures and measures that we would like to see, and this is one I think we would agree we believe in. So those are 2 reports that we look at. The report on the right as the teacher, those little specks are students. And so if you were to click on a speck, it's going to dive into the individual student, and it's going to show you something like more of this type of information. And what you see here, I just want to give the right name for it. Oh, it's just the class report. So when you look at this report, it's hard for me, of course, to see it from back here. Dr. Benante's feedback was make it bigger. I did, I still can't see it. I think that's a sign of my age at this point. But you'll see students listed, and again, these are not our students. This is just a sample report that I pulled. It provides you the time when we tested, the grade level. It provides you, what you see there are the achievement scores, those 3 columns, and where you see a bold, it's allowing you to pinpoint then what goals or what performance areas they may struggle in or they may be doing better in. So for example, A is listed as literature, right? So if a student's scores for their achievement in the A column are lower, you then recognize, okay, I need to focus on literature with this child. And it can go even deeper into what aspects of literature should you focus on. So these are the reports, again, that we look at. One very important piece on this slide right here is what's time or duration, I think, or test duration it says. That was really interesting for us to analyze a little bit this year. So for a student who took 10 minutes to finish their entire assessment, you know you don't have a valid score. For students who took around 50 minutes, they were probably on task, attentive, and working through it. So when we administered it, there were some scores that we didn't get valid measures on. We did not go back and try to chase down students to retake the assessment. Managing that would have been, I think, not a good use of our time in the moment. So those are the reports we looked at. So what did we find? While we were looking at these, we were looking for students who had low achievement scores. We were looking for low or negative growth. We looked at time spent on the exam, which I mentioned. We then looked at historical performance in class. So not just this test, but how did they do last year? Yes, we didn't have the 8th grade assessments last year, but hey, Mr. Keating, how did they end the year? What were their assessments like? Were there areas you were concerned about? So that came into play. We looked at current. Now, by the time we analyzed this, we're talking about the end of October. By the time we administered We had department meetings, we were able to analyze, we're looking at October. How has September gone? How are the first few weeks of the school year? I'll talk a little bit more about class assessments next, but we did see that we needed to increase our math support at the high school. We put in another math support class. A lot of our students that we looked at that we were concerned about their achievement or their growth rate had already been identified and put in math lab classes, which exist at the high school, or in ELA support classes. So we did need to do an increase. We had the FTE. Mr. Houlihan teaches that course, and it's a combination of multiple maths in one room. But we would say about a 4% increase in math support that was needed in addition to those already identified.
Just before you...
Sure.
I'm sorry, do you mind if I interrupt and ask a question?
No, I don't mind.
All right. You said something that was interesting. So did I hear correctly that a number of the students that you were concerned about who either had low achievement or low growth had already been identified as needing support? And I'm assuming that is like pre-COVID?
Yes.
Okay.
It would be pre-COVID. It would be when guidance counselors are meeting, in those individual meetings in 8th grade. How are you doing in math? What are your scores? We have math lab classes. Would that benefit? Talking to teachers. Are there students you're concerned about in terms of mathematics? Looking at 7th grade math assessment data that came from the state. Looking at historical NWEA data, not just this one COVID year data, but how did they score? Excuse me, in the spring of 7th grade and then in the fall of 8th grade compared to now the fall of 9th grade. So you have longitudinal data to be able to look at to make those decisions. So yeah.
Do you think that that's so it's obviously concerning that you see a divergence of, like, it's exacerbated a situation that's already existing, right? Would be my read.
I would agree with that it probably exacerbated a situation that was already,
So do you think that is a reflection on math, or are there like study skills and learning skills and like other things that are manifesting themselves in?
I think the sequential nature of math potentially, could exacerbate that. I do know nationally in the studies that have been done, we're not unique to seeing it, within mathematics. I don't know how deep to go into the analysis of the data from NWEA, but they normed their data differently, right? They didn't norm their data differently. The data looks different this year, normed nationally because of COVID. Yeah. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's fine. I do think it exacerbated for our struggling students. Yeah. It has made it even harder. Hence, things like vulnerable population in school every day, right? Really trying to make sure we're targeting that vulnerable student who is making low growth, low achievement, and supporting them. And I know at the beginning we were bringing in our students that maybe had IEPs or there were other things. I will say we're really analyzing that vulnerable population beyond just students with IEPs. Okay. And Dr. Benante has been great about that. Yeah, let's look at it. If we can, let's get them in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So just an interesting tidbit right now. I think oftentimes in high schools, you have your unit and maybe there's a project-based activity, but oftentimes there's still that summative assessment at the end of the unit. How'd you do? And then when you get your grade. And we move on. And I think what we're seeing, and this came from the teachers, right? I put out to every department, talk to me a little bit how assessments are going. Everybody kept saying the formative assessments are working better. Formative assessments seem to be working better. Yes, we're still doing summative, right? Formative being a small snippet of time, not necessarily at the end of a unit, but throughout, allowing students to take a look at it and make some adjustments. And then anytime they're giving summative, they talk about writing and application of writing and having things be a little bit more narrative in terms of summative assessments, which I think is kind of nice to hear. So as we talk about how we're identifying these students, we're using NWEA, but we're also taking a look at how they're doing in the classroom. So I mentioned a little bit about this. We saw that we had about 4% more students that we wanted to make sure we were providing some math support for. So we had already had math labs in algebra. We had already had math labs for geometry courses, but we put in a math support class that Mr. Hulen magically teaches and remediates algebra, geometry, and algebra 2 trig all at the same time. And it does a nice job. Now it's an hour and 20-minute class, so it's nice that you can get to other students and really support them. But using the data and having the data on the students is definitely helpful. In terms of ELA, we have ELA support class, and our students were identified and already receiving the ELA support class. I will say, though, in talking with Nancy Martinez, the department chair, 2 areas that we continue to look at the data is vocabulary acquisition and reading fluency. And a couple years ago at the high school, maybe 2 years ago now, the high school independent reading work really focused on not just, okay, read your book, but let's talk about your book. Let's spend some time together on where you are as a reader. How often are you reading? How long are you reading? And really working at the individual level to build that fluency with our high school students. And I think we see it in our data. So now what? Moving forward, I think what we would want to do now is take a look at vertical articulation and our NWEA, right? Are there areas we historically see achievement low? Are there areas, I'm talking K-12, right, all the way through. Are there areas that we're not growing the way we would like to? And let's evaluate that further. So that vertical articulation work, or strategy 1 of our coherence plan. And then professional development, falling under strategy 2, there are so many reports within NWEA that provide an enormous amount of information. It's overwhelming to even get to it all, but I think we could maybe take the next step, diving into a little bit more of what are some tools to use for that individual learner to help them grow in areas that they may struggle in. I mentioned that, using the instructional tools, which was what I was just talking about. And then lastly, this one has kind of come up more recently, is a writing lab. We don't have a specific, I'll use AIS because I think everybody kind of knows that term, and AIS for writing. But what we're seeing in the humanities, social studies, and the new framework, the amount of writing and reflection and analysis and synthesizing that the students are expected to do within their writing is challenging. And it's nonfiction writing. It's different than fiction writing and how you approach it. So taking a look at some form of a writing lab. We have creative writing class for our students who love writing and they want to expand their writing, but how do we focus a little bit more on those students that are struggling with writing in both subject matters? So that's the analysis of the data, focusing on the whole child a little bit at the high school and the impact of COVID. As I mentioned, you see a lot more students saying, I'm just going to learn virtually because I don't want to have to quarantine and be home. How do we get our students back to what we love about Haldane, our community, and who we are, and feeding off the energy of one another? We've made a big push to make sure our extracurricular activities are happening either virtually or safely during lunchtime. You'll see a list of the ones that are currently up and running right now. If you were here a little earlier, I know Margaret spoke about the basketball game, but play practice was going on up here till 7, and now play practice just moved down to the music room for the second play, since you all know there's 3 of them going on right now, to make sure they're potted in small groups. And our athletics have started back up again, which is breathing life, I think, into the building, and you can feel it and you can see it within the students, the level of excitement. And local live, if you haven't had a chance to jump on and watch, you can watch from the luxury of your own home, which has been great. Clinical support has obviously been critical through this time. This is the hyperlink. I think you all have the presentation, but you can take a look at, we update that. Clinical resources and resources for families and parents. Our social workers and guidance counselors put that out and update that off of our guidance website on the high school. We have multiple times been pushing into social studies and English classes. I say social studies and English because those are the classes you take for 4 straight years and everyone's taken them, so you know you can hit every kid. Where math and science is, it's not the same pattern that they all follow. So Mr. Manny has been pushing in, as has Mrs. Kachin, who is now on maternity leave, but Mrs. Fridovich actually is pushing in this week into 10th grade. We still have our weekly clinical meetings, virtually of course, and then child study team meetings. Anytime there is a student concern, whether it's from a parent, whether it's from a teacher, bringing them to child study team to figure out what plans we can put in place to support them at the high school. I'm not going to read these. I will just leave them up, unless you think I should read them. I don't know if I could see them.
If you could highlight, I just had a chance to glance them at, Julia, any particular comments or themes that you felt emerged?
Yeah.
Because I know you were checking in with students. I know you continually check in with kids
Yeah.
and have throughout this year, but themes that you feel are emerging. And I know you included a few specific quotes from students at each grade level who also may be all remote or all in.
It's like a combination of all three. I made sure I had a combination of all three.
But if you wouldn't mind, just because we've had some really interesting conversations around this, what are you hearing from the kids about their experiences now? What's on their minds?
I think there's an appreciation that our students have for the work that their teachers are doing and the recognition of managing it all. Our students miss seeing their classmates. They don't love that they're cohorted, and if their last name is S and their friends are in B, they're not seeing them in school. I think that's a big piece for them. I think they are feeling a sense of growth within themselves and recognizing the ownership that they've had to take over their learning a little bit more than they have in the past, where our small class size and being right on top of them, we've been able to, hey, you didn't do this, you didn't do this. Now there's a little bit more ownership that they have had to take over time. I think that probably there are some students who miss that dialogue and that debate and that discussion in the classroom with everybody, because when the students are on camera and home, they're less apt to engage the same way they would in the room. So you'll see some of that within the quotes too. And so finally, I just have this short little 2-minute video that 2 of our juniors put together. This they did back in September or October as part of that research and presentation course with PBS. So this was submitted to PBS. It didn't make it on the PBS show, but this was one of the videos the students put together. So I'll just share it. It's perspective from the student and the teacher.
Since March of 2020, education has changed majorly. With the pandemic still affecting us, Haldane High School has been on a hybrid schedule, which has brought many changes to students and teachers' lives. I asked my teacher about some of the adjustments she had to make before school this year.
I would say tailoring lessons with slideshows that are able to share on the screen has been a big help. And also truly just like getting to know Zoom better has been kind of the biggest change. I would
Students have also been affected by this new learning style, and I wanted to know how they felt about the new teaching methods.
I think they've taken extra steps to make sure that they're engaging equally with the kids in person and the kids online. And then when we're fully online, I think they make sure to ask us more questions than they normally would, and check in and make sure we're understanding everything more than they would if we were in the classroom.
After hearing from a teacher and a student on what school is like now, I wanted to know what they miss most about school before COVID.
I love being able to work with my students in small groups and walk around the room and feel we're not being too close and we're not endangering one another.
I miss seeing my friends in the halls because we're separated by cohort, and I miss being able to go to school every day and see all my teachers.
Lastly, I wondered what my teacher thought people should know about teaching in a pandemic.
It's difficult, but at the end of the day, it's worth it. I love my students, and like figuring out any way to continue education and make sure that we're safe while we're doing it, I think is worth it. It's really weird to be teaching from my home and have my pets join my class, but like we're doing what we have to do.
After hearing from my teacher and peer, it's evident that we just want one thing: to continue education.
So, that concludes my presentation.
Any other questions for Julia or comments?
That was great. I think I have one sort of minor question.
Sure.
So I actually don't know what a math lab class is. Is that an additional class, or they have like algebra?
Yeah.
And then they have another period of
Yeah,
algebra?
just like a science where you have science and then you have science lab.
Gotcha.
We have
That
math
makes
and then we
so
have
much
math
sense.
lab.
Gotcha.
So it's
Thank
connected
you.
to it.
I wasn't, yeah.
All right, I have a question. I'm going to put you on the spot because Dr. Selke isn't here. But, so the question is related to, I noticed that in her report, they're doing an assessment of new curriculum for middle school math. So my question back to sort of the vertical learning approach, how does what they're doing integrate with, how is that tied into you, is the question.
Well, it's clearly tied in because you want to make sure whatever's selected, right?
Yep.
What Works Clearinghouse, you want to make sure there's, measures of what the program they're using has been vetted, the research on it. Does the research show it's working?
Right.
You want to make sure it's aligned with New York State standards
Right.
As it's coming up. I think when you look at NWEA and you look at the data and you're trying to say, let's pick a program that matches the data, I don't know that would be worth doing, especially with our students and their population and how they tend to perform on NWEA assessments.
Right.
I think I'll speak now like high school wise, the real like looking at what tool will work is when you're talking about your vulnerable population and the needs and the specific needs they need to make growth, and looking at those tools that you learn, that you're using.
Yeah. And I apologize, I didn't ask the question really well. How does it matter what they pick versus what you currently use? How does that integration?
You want to make sure there's an alignment.
Yeah.
You want to make sure there's no major gaps.
Yeah.
You want to make sure, right? We often see the spiral of mathematics content from year to year, right? Numbers and operations, geometric, understanding that, statistics and probability, like those 5 standards. You just want to make sure those things are continuing through.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. It matters in the sense that your vertical alignment works.
Yes. Okay.
Let's also remember, though, high school mathematics is different. 8th grade is one thing because they're offering algebra too. When you're in 7th grade, you're still focusing on the mathematics standards and all of them. Whereas you start getting into high school, you're taking algebra, then you're taking geometry. It's much more focused in terms of the courses, algebra 2 trig, and so forth and so on.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What's happening with the kids, which is exactly what we asked for, and I really appreciated it. It was really great how you broke down the NWEA in a way that really made sense for me about what you're looking at and how you're looking at it. That was really helpful. Can you talk a little bit? You kind of touched on it, but the staff has made all of these adjustments, right? Like you were talking about going to teaching a class period that's an hour and 20 minutes. I mean, just that is a big shift in teaching style. Can you talk a little bit about the supports that the staff are getting, the climate, how is everybody doing? It's been such a challenging year for our staff, and yet, I mean, they all seem to be really rising to the occasion in such a beautiful way. But can you just talk a bit about how you manage that?
They definitely have risen to the occasion. It's definitely not always smooth sailing. I think there's been a lot of work to individually check in on staff and how they're doing. I think we made some minor adjustments in schedule that have helped. I think front-loading some of the superintendent's conference days at the beginning of the year have helped. I think that having social workers check in just not on students, but just the space to talk with teachers has been helpful. I think the professional development, especially when it relates to the technology aspect, has helped. Saying things like, don't pick 10 gadgets, pick 1 or 2 that are going to help you master those, and then, go from there. I know we was talking today, we were looking at how many went and got Google certified right now, and that was optional, right? People just chose to go and do it. I think I had like a third of the high school staff went and became Google certified. So I think they too are taking on the challenge as best as they can right now. Trying to find those nice ways to also know that we're here and supporting as best we can. That's
what we can do.
That's what we're doing right now. Is as best as we can. Continuing to let them know how much we appreciate them. I've talked to Dr. Benante about this a lot. Our staff, or the staff at the high school, and I believe in all buildings, put even more pressure on themselves and trying to tell them it's not the same as last year. We're doing the best you can, you're doing the best you can, and it's so appreciated. And, sometimes trying to remind them to take a deep breath, step away from it, turn the email off on the weekends. You have to step away to take care of yourself to be a better teacher on Monday morning. And so constant reminders of that.
Right, because one of the unique challenges of the high school, as we were talking about earlier, is that they still have Regents exams, AP exams. Kids going to college next year. None of that's stopping, right? Yeah. So there's this added pressure to, fulfill all the same requirements, just in a completely different environment.
I mean, one point to what you're saying, and what I'm saying is that sometimes I'm saying to them, okay, slow down, right? College Board just put out, do you want to give your AP exams the beginning of May, the middle of May, or the beginning of June? Now they're offering 3 options of when you want to administer AP exams. So now I bring the AP teachers together yesterday and I say, let's talk through this. And some of them are like, we need June, we need more time with these kids, we need to, and then I'm like, those kids come June, I don't know those seniors are gonna wanna say on June 5th as opposed to May 5th, let me now take this AP class. So the discussion of leading to, we're gonna do it at the end of May, but to your point, those things are still there. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody have any more questions for Julia? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Having that. Okay, we're going into communication from the public. Does anybody have anything they'd like to communicate to us? No? Okay. There'll be another opportunity later. Going into information reports, our student advisor is not here, and Ms. Jamin is. So Ms. Jamin, could you join us, please?
So I just wanted to highlight a couple of positive things that were going on at the elementary. First, I think highlights one of my favorite things about Haldane, which is that because we are in a K-12 building, there's so much collaboration between the elementary, the middle, and the high school. Obviously, this year with trying to cohort and maintain safety, it's a lot less. But the DCI class at the middle school and the elementary school just did our 100 cans of kindness for the 100th day of school, which I can't actually tell you which day was the 100th day of school anymore. We were going to celebrate on the 12th, which then became a remote day, and then we were going to celebrate when we got back, and it was still a remote day. So we celebrated yesterday and today, with the kindergarten doing yesterday and the first grade doing today, and I think it was really a week and a half ago, but here we are, and we've had 100 days of school, and the DCI students came down to start collecting some of the cans, and the kindergartners wouldn't let them have them because they hadn't finished counting to 100 yet. But the surprise and joy from the DCI class at how many cans had been collected, and the kindergartners' enthusiasm about what they had done and showing how many things they had brought in. It's a special place that you don't always get to see middle schoolers and kindergartners excited about the same thing at the same time. So that's a great thing. And for Black History Month, we just increased our library with another 25 books about Black artists and musicians, and each class has chosen a book that they are focusing on. With all of the snow, we are working with JV Forrestal in Beacon to see, they are studying Black STEAM innovators, so that the classes can hopefully link up. It's looking like with the snow and schedules that, you know, teachers are under a lot of pressure, and I don't know that all of our classes will meet with all of their classes, but we are at least going to have some classes from Haldane share what artists they learned about and who they read about with a class from there, and what STEAM innovator they learned about and read about, and have some discussions. Probably more likely the beginning of March instead of the month of February again with the snow, but learning about anything is important, whatever the timeline. And then last, this wasn't in my report because I forgot. It was also delayed with the snow, but we had our kindergarten orientation for parents that had been snowed out and then rescheduled, and met with 25 parents virtually to give them the orientation as they start their registration process. So kindergarten registration started, it happened some on the 12th, not last week, and then resumed again yesterday. So our kindergarten class for next year is shaping up. So we're something that's normal and happening.
Ms. Jamin, do you have a sense of what size we can anticipate? Sorry, that's always the million-dollar question.
It's a little bit up in the air right now. I think by our next meeting, I'll have a better sense of that. We certainly had some families opt to not start last year, even though their children made the cutoff. And then we have some families this year that are registering but are sort of saying the same thing. They may hold off. So I think I'll have a little bit of a better sense by our next meeting as to what that size will look like.
Great, thank you.
And some of the so usually our kindergarten teachers visit the preschools. Some of the preschools, like Haldane, have restricted visitors, and so we'll do more of a phone conference with those preschools to touch base with them on the students that are with them. Some are still allowing limited visitors, so we'll have a combination of visits, and I think that'll help us also gauge the size.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Sniffen, come back. Come back and talk more to us.
Just something quickly to mention that was in the works that we were actually able to make happen over the last couple days is our National Honor Society students need to do National Honor Society hours of service. And we've been able to have our students pair up with elderly citizens that are struggling to get appointments for their COVID shots. And having two elderly parents myself and having to navigate that for them with 27 phone calls back and forth to them, I can understand it is a challenging thing to do and navigate right now. So just a kudos to Ms. Papero and Ms. Granisi. I think they're working with Town Councilwoman Judy Farrell to try to help partner up somebody struggling and navigating the appointments with students. So I thank them, the students, and Judy for putting that together.
Nice, thank you. Dr. Seelke is not here this evening, but her report is there for our review. And Ms. Rounds.
Good evening. I wanted to share with the board tonight that we are starting the process in the special education department of our annual reviews. This starts in February, and it takes up it takes up a bulk of our time from now until the end of the school year. And our annual reviews are when our providers assess the progress of our students who have IEPs, and then plan for next year in terms of creating goals for them for next year. We start at the high school level in January, February, and then we slowly move down into middle school students and then elementary school students. And I just wanted to talk about the fact that on the surface, it looks like a very mundane type of, we're turning out meetings, we're putting meetings on the schedule, where, we have these long agendas from now until the end of the year. But in looking at our IEPs that are being written right now and drafted right now, our teachers and our providers are being very thoughtful, and they always are, but I did want to highlight it, being very thoughtful in the level of individualized planning that they're doing for our students. And they're collaborating with one another, they're collaborating with their team members, with other providers, they're checking in with other staff members to talk about how students are doing in different areas, and they're collaborating with the students themselves. And when I'm reading these draft IEPs, you're seeing how much thought is really going into describing the students' strengths, describing their preferences, describing their interests, as well as describing, it's not just all, where are your challenges, it's how do you learn best, what works for you, and where could you use some more assistance. And I'm finding, we invite our secondary students to their IEP meetings, to their CSE meetings, and we've had very good participation so far with students coming to their meetings. And the meetings are heartwarming sometimes. We're hearing students talking about, with their teachers about, what really works for them. And teachers saying, wow, it's great to hear you talk about it in that way. It's great to hear you advocate for yourself. And so I just kind of wanted to talk to the board about that side of it, because it is something, like I said, that takes up such a big bulk of our time and seems like it's just meetings. But there's a lot of thought and there's a lot of meaning going into what our providers are doing right now and how much they're really examining each student in every area, in academics and management and social emotional development, and putting together quality plans for them for next year.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick question? I apologize. Sure. This is always a subject of fascination for me. So I agree, and I agree, or I don't know, I'm not the right person to assess, but I would think that these are super important meetings, and they obviously take up a lot of time and energy. Just in terms of how are students doing? How have they done towards what the goals they were for this year, and what are their goals for next? I think it's great. And you certainly do that at an individual level, and everybody has their own conversation about each. Holistically, would you say that there's anything that you're seeing that cuts across all students in who have an IEP that would be an opportunity, or there are some commonalities that you would want to highlight for the department or for that cohort of students, where you say, this is something we're doing really well, or this is, to your point, an area where we might need to provide more resources?
So let me think about that for a minute. I think that we do a very good job of, here at Haldane, of being inclusive and meeting our students' needs in an ICT or an inclusive environment. And what I think that I would like to focus on more in the future, which we're focusing on more right now, is what I've talked about in the past is universal design for learning, and really developing more strategies at every level for even the general education teachers to employ, to put into place, that can help every student, but certainly help our students with disabilities. So, thank you.
Mr. Walsh.
Good evening. The Facilities Department spent the bulk of February just managing the weather and all of the storms that we've received. I read that the first 22 days of February, we had 13 days of snow. The crew has spent a lot of man hours working each and every storm, whether it's pre-storm activities through pre-treatment, PMing equipment, the actual event itself where we call everyone back to campus to do the work of removing the snow, and any post-storm activities, which has been very important this year, which is just moving the snow back in anticipation of the next storm, which just seemed to be the next day away. The crew has been great at responding to the storms when they need to be. A lot of times that happens, when it needs to happen, whether it's late at night in the evenings, like last night removing the snow, early morning hours before the students get to campus, and many weekends during this past year. So we're really looking forward to breaking this pattern, the spring weather, and hopefully that stays. As we look forward past spring into the summer, the contractor working for the elementary school building, the window replacement, Arrow Steel, they have provided all their submittals to the architect. They have approved those submittals, and they're currently in line with the manufacturer for those windows. We anticipate receiving them in June, which is great for our schedule moving forward into the summer. The second half of the capital work that we have is the electrical mechanical upgrades. That's still at the state under review. We anticipated getting those back in approval status at the end of February, beginning of March. So we're still on schedule, and we'll keep you updated as those plans come back approved. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going into consent agenda minutes. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. These are our minutes from the February 2nd and February 4th meetings. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Aye. Consent agenda personnel. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Unfinished business. Here we are. We postponed this from our last meeting due to fatigue. And here we are for our mid-year self-evaluation that I will turn over to Mr. Headland to lead us through.
Awesome. Thank you very much. A reminder to the board, to the public, and to anybody who may be watching. We set out last year to make sure that we were doing self-evaluations, much like we do superintendent evaluations, which involves a mid-year high-level self-evaluation, then an end-of-year more detailed. We use the same rubric that we do for the superintendent. 5 standards and 5 practices for each. I can never remember standards or practices. For mid-year, we try to hold it to the high-level points of things that we're doing well or things that we feel like we should be focused on. I shared the full detailed response with the entire board. The things that I would highlight and raise up for conversation would be that, and I'll read what I wrote, which is, in general, the positive feedback and constructive input is invariably balanced with positive statements. I think it's usually good. There seems to be general interest in pushing ourselves with new ideas in several categories that all seem to be longer-term opportunities rather than short spring opportunities. And there, as I thought of as follows in 4 categories. 1, codifying and publicizing our participation in board training and the training that we do to be a more effective board, to support the district and do better decision-making, all those sorts of things. 2nd, enabling space for more introduction consideration of diverse approaches and ideas, which I think is always great. In any team where you're trying to come up with new solutions, having a diverse set of input is always useful. 3rd was expanding our outreach impact with legislators, public officials. I think that actually has some short-term implications, given the work that's being done by some people in terms of working with our state senators and lobbying and advocacy. And 4th, and I think this has come up recently through a number of conversations, both through HR and also in terms of how we think about tenure, is increasing our support of the hiring of exceptional teachers. And that's something we certainly need to think about. What's the appropriate role for the board, and how can we help the district be more successful? So those are the 4 areas that people had surfaced as opportunities for us. I think there's a great recognition that we're doing a good job and continue to function well as a board. There's always room to do more, and I think there's a good opportunity to use especially our summer retreat to focus on some of these longer-term initiatives that we've planned. For the other 2 short-term, one of them being our summary and self-evaluation. I can also talk to our new member training manual, which I'll do at new business or sometime at the end. But that's, any comments from anybody else on the board?
I mean, we kind of gave our comments via email to John. So for the public, the way this worked was each board member did a little self-assessment, self-reflection on the board's role, sent it to John. He very nicely put it all together for us in a summary. So I think each of us individually have had time to reflect individually and then also to read each other's thoughts and words. And I think John did a great job of summarizing these 4 areas that are opportunities for growth. I don't know if we have anything else. Does anyone have anything they'd like to comment on about the 4 areas?
I think the idea that this is something for us to explore, I mean, I don't even know if we'll have time with the budget and everything to explore it before we do our end of year evaluation, but I do like, I mean, in particular, I mean, making some decisions, right? Like, these are things where we think we could move forward. I think you made that clear. And are they things that we actually really want to do? This isn't a board. I think sort of individually, we've attended trainings or gone to conventions or done something. And the same thing with the outreach and impact, actually with legislators and public officials, but I actually intended, and I probably didn't make it clear, just generally in the legislative process. So for example, what happens with the annual convention in terms of it's having its slate of issues that it wants board feedback on. And again, like, these are things that I think we've kind of done. Those are 2 issues where I think folks have done their own thing, which is great, right? But do we want to do it more systematically? And to me, that's a question for us to decide if we do or not, or do we want to focus on one or the other?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's something that I think at least I'll say since my time on the board, it's been more individually driven.
Exactly.
If there's an individual board member who is interested in that aspect of board service, then that individual board member does that. Yeah. But it would certainly be a more powerful statement if the whole board was doing it, but that would have to be something that we would all collectively.
Yeah, and not even necessarily the whole board, but is it something that the board wants to prioritize? And so there would be a person who would be, or a small group that would be tasked with bringing these things forward to the, to the board, or sort of making decisions about, sort of self-evaluation. Where do we think we would benefit from additional training, or something like that? So. I thought John did a really great, it was great to see everybody's comments, but I did really see this as sort of a first step of like, are we really ready to sort of.
Yeah, it's almost like this is our step to think about this stuff.
Yeah.
Now that we've gotten everybody's feedback, now we can sit with it and think about it, maybe incorporate it into the final assessment, perhaps more so incorporating it into goals for next year, really. This is almost about goal development for next year. Like, this is where the goal development starts. I'll just make a comment. The last piece, increasing support of the hiring of exceptional teachers. I just wanted to say that that's really reflective of what we were discussing with the human resources director position. That's how the board does that. The board we're not going to be in the room going through the Google search to make sure the teacher is exceptional. That's not our job. But we can certainly make sure that we have the constructs in place to support the hiring of exceptional teachers, right? And things like supporting human resources development. I mean, that's exactly that, in my opinion.
Right. And that's actually really helpful, because I wasn't going to bring it up, but I read that one and I was like, I'm not even sure, like, exactly directly what we could do that we aren't already doing, which is to provide our guidance and clear expectations that that's happening. But Jen brings up a really very good point that there may be systemic changes that we can make
That's right.
in our role as board members that could support that. And so that's a super helpful clarification. I appreciate that.
Yep, yep.
And I would point out, even for the engagement with legislators, public officials, or even board training, I think part of the expectation is we're probably doing more than we know off the top of our head. Like, I could probably rattle through some things that we've been doing, but just making clear, sort of linking and labeling a little bit. Like, these are the things that the board has, even as individuals, been involved with advocacy meetings or meetings with the state, and that's part of our, we may not ultimately decide that that is something we want to prioritize and make a clearly defined role of the board, but people will naturally do it from time to time, and it's important for us to recognize that, just sort of put that out there and say, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention, it seems like a good time to mention it, the consideration of diverse approaches. I think that was brought up as, it'd be interesting to have people on the board who disagree, right? We so often agree with each other, not all the time, but bringing in diverse ideas is always really interesting and beneficial. And thinking about diversity, I'm going to share this because my loose link, and I'm remembering to share it, is that we talked about doing a joint training with the Garrison School District, and this is where our self-evaluation, if you guys remember, came from, right? We did this, we approached this with the Garrison School District last year? Last January. And so they invited us to, they're exploring the idea of bringing in a diversity and equity training for their board, and they invited us to be a part of that with them. And so I'm just gauging interest, and if that's of interest, then I'll continue the conversation with them about how it would work and what they're thinking. Is that sounding like maybe a good?
Yes, that sounds like a really good thing.
Interesting. Sean, I'm seeing Sean nod. Okay, so I'll continue that conversation for some more professional development.
Great.
With our colleagues.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So anything else about this, guys? Oh, yes, John, can you, we also put the goals here as a reminder to us about our Board of Education goals, and that the goals were not specifically part of the self-evaluation. And I kind of thought about it secondary. I said to John, I'm like, are we supposed to talk about the goals at this point? Because it's not part of it, but anyways, so here are the goals, to remind ourselves what we said our goals were. I don't know if you guys had a chance to review them or had any comments about where we're at with them.
Well, the one thing I would say is I feel like the more time we get into the policy process, the more I sort of go back and I would downgrade us maybe in previously. You know how it's one of those things where you think you're doing okay, and then the more you learn about what you're supposed to be doing, the more you realize, like, oh, wow, like, there's more to do. So that is one of the things that I said in the summary, is that I think if I were to go back, I'd probably give us a developing or on policy for maybe last year. Because I do think it's really still developing, but actually in a pretty productive way, right? I mean, I think it's a complicated process. And, we've had, a few meetings where we're like, okay, because there's so many different moving pieces. So that's the one thing where I did think about that and filling out. I think because I'm involved in the policy stuff, and it's a direct practice. But yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And John sent out a starting place for our new board member. Did everyone respond to that? Did you guys read that? John, did you get responses?
I did get responses.
Okay.
Not from everybody, but that's okay.
If anybody would like to respond,
No,
I'm reminding you to respond.
I actually went and found it today.
That's okay.
So,
Here's my commitment, is that is my, saying this in front of everybody, that is mine to own. I put out what I thought was a one way to structure the content. Content structure can be done in any way, shape, or form. My request to anyone would be, is the right content, are the right subjects in there? If you feel it is either too much or too little, please let me know. And I had a side passing conversation with Leah just in terms of how to store it and manage it, but I will work on developing the content, which I think is a large ish lift at the beginning, and then should be a fairly straightforward, ongoing maintenance project over the course of time. Don't feel like you need to say, I think you need to write, this is just how we store it. Just tell me, like, are there topics you feel I have not
Included.
captured that you would think would be absolutely essential for somebody new? And then we'll go from there.
Great.
And I will work towards creating the content so it's available.
Fantastic.
Okay? Thank you.
Okay, I think we're good on that. Thank you, John,
Yeah.
for helping us along. Okay, we're going into the CSE, CPSE recommendations. I turn it to Ms. Platt.
Be it resolved that, upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby approves the recommendations of the Committees on Special Education and Preschool Special Education as presented.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Is there any communication from the public at this time? No. Okay, going into our board committee reports, policy committee update. Peggy, do you have anything you'd like to say for us besides we need to keep doing better?
We're still waiting to get the, I think I gave the update. We're
Yep.
still waiting to get the updated policy manual back.
Yes,
And
we're in a
we're-
holding pattern, I
Yes.
believe. Okay, thank
But
you.
working to stay
Current.
engaged in the process that we set up, which was, following the updates and things like that.
Great. The WIPSPA update, so we spoke a little bit about it. Dr. Benante mentioned it. WIPSPA is in legislative advocacy hot pursuit right now. I know Sean and Margaret and Dr. Benante attended a chat with Ms. Serino and Ms. Galliff to plead our case, to get them to understand that we need more funding and less mandates. I went to a legislative panel with the New York State Senators, which included Ms. Stewart Cousins and Ms. Mayer, who's the committee chair for education. And I'll share just a couple of things that were positive, which were Ms. Stewart Cousins, who's the majority leader. She said that she felt like this was an opportunity moment to make some changes in how school funding happens. And because the dust is getting kicked up, she was optimistic that there's some room for shifting, which I appreciated. And she also really drove home that we are very supported right now with our leaders, that there's a real commitment to education that she has never seen before. So that felt good. It's an uphill battle. Ms. Mayer encouraged us to advocate directly to the governor's office. She's like, we're on your side. You don't need to advocate to us. You need to advocate to the governor's office. So I took that as constructive information. And yeah, so we keep on going. And I think we all receive the WIPSPA emails about ways to advocate and legislative priorities, and so that's where we are right now. Hot pursuit for sure. Okay, board reflections. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share?
I do. So I will announce that I have no intention of running again for board. 6 years is a good long time. So I just wanted to open that up in case anyone was looking at running against an incumbent. I will not be the incumbent, but John, you're running, right? Are you up?
I'm going to try again.
You're going to try again.
Because it's been a lot of fun.
I will find other ways to serve the community, but my days as a Haldane School Board member are coming to an end.
Do we have any community members on the Code of Conduct Committee? Because I don't know if that committee can function without you on it.
I've been very quiet on that committee. But I would say that, the person that I would like to replace me, I would like to find someone, as we're looking to tap people on the shoulder, I would love to see someone up here. I think one thing that we really have a lack of is when we don't have someone that actually went to Haldane.
I think that's really a really important perspective to have because of the long ingrained kind of history that Haldane has. It's nice to have somebody that's been through it and been here. I think it's an important perspective to have. Right now, we don't have that. I'm as close as we can get without going over, but I did not go to Haldane, contrary to popular belief. And I would like to see someone, if we could, of someone who has some connection to the athletics part of it. Just because that is a gap that we kind of don't have with the existing board members. Their kids aren't old enough yet, or it wasn't their thing, or whatever. So I think those are two kind of really important things that I'd like to see. So if you're looking at someone to tap on the shoulder, those are things that I would like to see someone fill in my shoes.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share? Sean, from the Peanut Gallery over there, you're good?
I'm great.
Okay. Dr. Benante, do you have anything you'd like to share?
No closing remarks. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, so I'm going to make a motion for us to convene into executive session for the purpose of discussing collective negotiations pursuant to Article 14 of the Civil Service Law. May I have a second, please?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. We will not be returning. Cecilia, thank you very much.